Welcome to Compass. Our mission is navigating people to God. I'm Drew. I'm one of the pastors here. And if you're a guest, I'd love to meet you after the service. Come into the guest gathering if you can out of the main hall. We'd love to put a face to a name. And I want to welcome those of you who are watching online, especially Christy, who's watching in Tanzania, Africa. So glad that you're watching today. Love to having you here today with us, and all of our online community. Glad that you're with us today. Before we begin, this is Veterans Day weekend, and we want to, by all means, honor our brave men and women who have served our country. If you're currently serving or you have previously served in the armed forces, would you please stand today? We want to honor you. Would you please stand today? Several on the balcony. We're very proud of you, and we thank you for your service, and we'll be trying to think of you all weekend as we work our way through the weekend here at Compass. And a few years ago on Christmas Eve, I was kind of excited about the holiday. I love Christmas Eve at Compass, and it was just a festive lobby, and I was getting some coffee, and I'm walking around and talking to certain people, and there's a mom who is coming through the door over here by the porte-cochere, and she's coming through with her daughter, who is a kind of toddler age, and they're walking through, and I overhear a conversation, and she says to her mom, "Okay, Mommy, I'm ready to go to class now." And she says, "Honey, it's Christmas Eve. There's no class for your age group. You're going to come in with me and hear Pastor Drew preach." And she looked at her mom and she went, "Boring." And I was right there. I mean, I'm less than 10 feet away, and I'm hearing all of this, so I'm laughing all the way back to the green room. And then I got back to the green room and my mind got the better of me, and I'm like, man, I wonder how many other people think my messages are boring, Kind of got to me a little bit. I wanted to find that little girl and say, thanks to you, I need therapy, And then we've started this new Thursday night service here recently, and so now I have to kind of be ready earlier in the week with my message, and it's not that easy to make that quick a turnaround. And so on Thursday night, it's not uncommon for me as I walk away from the message to say, oh my gosh, I should have said this, or why didn't I say that? And then inevitably I think to myself, that was like not good. And I go home and my wife's waiting for me. Usually she's getting dinner ready on a Thursday night, and she'll ask me, hey, how did the sermon go? And I'll say, worst sermon ever, worst sermon ever. She totally ignores me and says, oh, great. How do you want your hamburger cooked? She doesn't even listen to that anymore. Now, to be fair, I would submit to you that every pastor has a worst sermon ever moment, right? I mean, it's just going to happen. Pastors are human. They're going to have some of those moments. I would even argue that in John chapter 6, Jesus actually had one of those moments. I mean, before you hear me out, listen, it's a sermon where Jesus kind of loses the crowd. And if you were to read in John 8, you'd find that it's a very unusual message that apparently the whole crowd thought was a little strange. Here's how John describes it. He says, many of his disciples said, this is very hard to understand. How can anyone accept this? It's not like there was a little village girl running through, the village going, boring, nothing like that. But it was just one of those things where, Jesus was just not quite on his game according to the people. I mean, they had to like the free food that Jesus had given them earlier in the chapter when he fed 5,000 people. They had to love the miracles that he performed. But in their mind, they just didn't really understand what he was trying to say. And look, I'll have to be honest with you today. This message is one of the messages where some people might be like, great, just when I was starting to like it here at Compass. I mean, I love the lattes out at the well, and the music is really good. And the pastor's been okay. I guess he hasn't rattled my cage too much. But what he's saying today, I just don't know if I can really accept that. So this could be kind of a John 6 moment for me if I'm not careful. And the next 3 weeks, we're talking about generosity. And it's normal for us to cover this. We cover it every November. If you are a guest with us today, just know that we're starting this series. We do this every year. You just happen to come on the day that we're talking, of course, a little bit about money. But it's normal for us to talk about this because Jesus talked about this more than anything else in Scripture. And I hope you'll hear me out because I want to teach you how to do something that you may think you already know how to do, but probably don't. And there's a risk of you being offended. This is a very personal and sometimes very sensitive topic. I want us to learn together how to be generous. And when I say generous, I'm not just talking about how to give. We all know how to give. I mean, we're coming into that season of year where we're going to all give lots of gifts to other people. We know how to give in America. A couple of weeks ago, Michelle and I were in the marketplace in New Delhi, India, and we're walking through the marketplace, and there are people coming up to us, asking us for money. They're trying to get us to buy whatever they're trying to sell. And our guide, Moses, grabbed me and he explained, here in India, Americans are considered among the most generous people in the world. They just are. We live in America, and Americans know how to give, but I would submit to you that very few people actually know how to be generous the Bible way. So this series isn't about what to do. Instead, it's a series on how to be, and I want us to learn over the next couple of weeks how to be generous people. And I know me saying this has some of you tuning me out. Like you might say that, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I've been very generous lately. Like I bought 5 boxes of Girl Scout cookies from the Girl Scouts. Like I always tip 20% at the restaurants, even if the service is not all that great. The other day when they asked me in the store if I wanted to donate $1 to the Children's Miracle Network, I said, I'll do even better. I'll donate $5. And we think of those moments when we had moments of generosity. But I want to talk today and throughout this series about how we can actually live a generous lifestyle. And again, I'm preparing you. There's going to be probably some uncomfortable moments the next 3 weeks because this gets very personal and it's just human nature. Isn't it true with you? It's true with me. As soon as somebody says you don't do something, you immediately think of that one time you did it, right? Like as soon as somebody says you're not a certain way, you'd like to think of the time you were that way. Like for you men, how many times has this happened? If you're married at some point in every marriage, and multiple points maybe in my marriage, our wives say to us, you just don't help much around the house. You just don't help much around the house. And then what is the first thing that comes to our minds, men? Our wives tell us we don't help around the house. We're like, babe, don't you remember that time in 2014 when I unloaded the dishwasher, right? Like, don't you remember that time? I mean, that was really cool. You came home and like the counter was cleaned off, the dishwasher was, was empty, and we did that. And so we kind of tend to point to moments where we were generous or we have been generous. And this is what I want to say up front today. Because of this, maybe this could be my John 6 moment. You may go home today and someone say, how was the message? And you'll be like, worst sermon ever. Like the guy was just completely struggling up there, tried to tell me I was one way and I'm not that way at all. But I think if you're willing to be honest for the next few weeks, this series can absolutely alter your life. Keyword willing. You've heard me say this. Compass is by far the most generous church I've ever served. Absolutely. That's 1,000% true. But what I've learned is that churches like ours, if we're not careful, we can run into some danger in the area of giving. And here's why. There are some extremely, extremely generous people in this church. And what happens is, because of their giving, it causes other people just kind of coast, to become complacent in their giving. That's a very natural thing in a church like ours. Kind of a let the rich people give mentality. I'll address that in a few moments. But the goal is for everyone to learn to be generous. For me to learn to be generous and for you to learn to be generous. For everyone. And we have done awesome. We have done great. But let's remember what we talked about last week. We can never really outgive God. We can't do it. We can't reach the ultimate in terms of our generosity. We can't do that. I remember what Lindsay said a few moments ago in the video. Sometimes we tend to put God in a box a little bit. Let's not do that. Let's not limit ourselves. Let's see what God wants for us. Because if we're honest with ourselves, we're pretty good at random acts of giving, okay? We're pretty good at random acts of giving. Some of us have that down and we equate it with being generous. Sure, I'll throw a couple quarters in the Ronald McDonald House bin. Since I'm eating 2 Big Macs, it's the least I can do, right? But the thing about random acts of giving is that they normally come at the end of a sales pitch. The little Girl Scout outside the grocery store saying, excuse me, mister, would you like to buy some Girl Scout cookies to help out the program? And you can't resist that face. And you're like, I'll tell you what, I'll buy 6 boxes and you can keep the change. And so we do little acts of giving from time to time and we call that generous. I want to just tell you this as gently as I can. That's not generous, that's average, okay? That's average. Most people do stuff like that. Most people are motivated by stuff like that. to get inspired about something and respond, or that we would feel guilt and respond. But listen, genuine generosity moves past inspiration or guilt. Truly generous people don't need Sarah McLachlan singing, "I will remember you," while the image of a malnourished dog is in the background, right? It's just the truth. Generous people have moved past that kind of thing. And look, this message, this series is as much for me as anyone else. I always thought I did a good job of being generous, but I realized I'm pretty good at giving, but I need to get better at being generous. There's a real difference. And I hope in this series, I hope to show you the difference. Because when you become generous, you will actually give more. And when you give more, you'll save more money and you'll consume less. I know that sounds like crazy talk. It's why we named this series Crazy Like Us. Jesus is going to take it one step further. He says, when you become generous, you'll actually give more. And when you give more, you'll save more money and you'll consume less. And you'll be happy on top of it. You'll find joy. I'm going to get to that in a few moments. Because there's a trickle-down effect when you become generous. Ordering your life around generosity affects every single part of your life and every single part of your finances. And there's a trickle-down effect every aspect of your life. But here's the thing. Being generous is not something that comes natural to any of us. It has to be taught. If you don't believe that, go talk to any parent of kids, any parent of small children, and they'll tell you that when their kids were little, one of the first words they learned was the word what? Mine. It's mine. Kids learn that. They don't share naturally. You have to teach them to be generous. You have to teach them to share. And this is the way it is with every one of us. We have to learn. It doesn't come natural to us. But you want to know what does come natural to us? Being crazy. Being crazy is natural for us, right? The reason we called Crazy Like Us is that we want to change the perception of what is normal. The reality today, and this is crazy, this isn't what I was taught, but it's the reality of most Americans today. Most Americans spend more money than they make. They do. How is that even possible? I'll tell you how. Through a thing called interest, okay? And you know what happens when you pay interest, right? Interest is when you pay more for something than it's really worth. That's what interest is. Interest is when you pay more for something that's really worth. That is crazier. And here's what's even crazier, okay? The stuff we pay interest for decreases in value. There's a few exceptions to that. Maybe a good piece of real estate, a good home that you buy at the right time strategically, and it could definitely increase in value. That happens here in Texas all the time. But for the most part, the stuff that we pay interest for decreases in value. So what happens is the cost increases while the value decreases. The cost increases while the value decreases. What happens over time is you end up spending more than you make, which is just plain crazy, but our culture thinks it's normal. And here's something that's just as crazy, okay? And if you've already tuned me out, I want you to hear this today, okay? We don't feel rich, but we are rich, okay? We don't feel rich, but we are rich, okay? I'm telling you this because this is what the Bible says, okay? 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul, who wrote about a third of the New Testament, he's talking to his young mentor. He's mentoring this guy named Timothy, and he says, I have a message for all the rich people. And here's what he says. I want you to command those who are rich in this present world. Now, I'm going to submit to you in just a few moments, just about everybody in our listening audience today is rich in this present world. I didn't say you had to like it, okay? I'm just saying I'm going to submit to you that that's the truth. I'm going to submit to you that just about everybody watching online is rich in this present world. So we should probably, and maybe it's 98%, I don't know, but we should probably listen to what Paul says to Timothy. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be what? To be rich. We're commanded to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and to be willing to share. Now, some of you, when you hear that, you're like, shoo, sigh of relief, because I'm not rich. I can skip this part. This is for other people. Because rich is the other guy, right? Rich is the guy who lives down the street and he's got more bedrooms than me, and he's got more cars than me, and he's got more trucks than me, and he's got a pool, and he's got a boat. I mean, rich is the other guy. Rich is the person who has more than me. That's who rich is. And this is how the average American defines the word rich. Rich is the person who has more than me. Now, I've been to places where I felt very rich. I have. I've spent 8 or 9 days in Haiti, in Cité du Soleil. I've been down there. They call it the slums of the Western Hemisphere. When I'm there, I feel rich. When I'm in Africa, in South Africa, I've been to the slums of the ghettos of Cape Town, South Africa. I've been there. I feel rich when I'm there. I've been to Mexico several times. Many times when I look at certain areas outside of Mexico City, I feel rich. Whenever I'm in India, I've been there 4 times. There's parts of India, you can't even believe the poverty. You can't even believe it. So I felt really rich. And then I came back home and I'd kind of shake it off a little bit and I'd go back to comparing myself to people who had more than me because that's where we're most comfortable. But deep down, I knew that compared to most people, many of us are rich in this present world. Here's the hard facts. New Global Rich List says if you make $32,400 a year, you're in the top 1% of wage earners in the world. In the world. If you make, we'll round it up, $33,000 a year. Now, I don't know what you all make, and I'm sure there's maybe even some people who are starting out in their careers, millennial couples, whatever, people that have worked really hard. Maybe you don't make $33,000 a year, but the average person, I would say, sitting in this room, I'm sure, makes a little more than $33,000 a year. And what we know about that is that makes us rich beyond belief in the present world. In fact, if you find yourself complaining about bad cell phone coverage, can't decide where you want to go on the cruise, slow internet, car trouble, right? Flight delays, Amazon doesn't have your size, watering ban in your neighborhood, right? These are rich people problems, okay? These are rich people problems. You understand that, right? Raise your hand if you understand that. Just raise your hand. These are rich people problems. Okay? And some of you aren't smiling. You're like, worst sermon ever. This guy knows nothing. Cannot wait to get out of here and get to Costa Vida. What is this guy talking about? I'm not rich, right? Do a self-inventory. I did it. I got a nice house. I got a barn. I got a mother-in-law's quarters, 3 cars, 14 pairs of shoes, a set of golf clubs, 2 great dogs, 2 computers, right? I can buy Pop-Tarts whenever I want. I'm rich. Right? I'm rich. We may not feel rich, but we are rich. On the flip side, we may feel generous some of the time, but we aren't. And that's what we're here to talk about. Believe me, I'd rather talk about a million different things than this. This is not the easiest message to give as a pastor, but it's something we have to address. It's something we have to talk about. And here's why I say that. If someone from a third world country were to look at your life right now, they would say that you are rich. I just returned from India on a mission trip, some parts of India. Again, you've never seen anything like it. There's poverty everywhere. If one of my friends in India encountered us and he or she actually heard us talking about feeling financial pressure, they would look at us and say, you have lost your mind. They would do that. You are so rich. I remember talking to one of my friends in Africa about a watering ban in our neighborhood. Oh, what? You water grass? Are you kidding me? You water grass? Have you lost your mind? So having said all that and offended some of you and stirred up the pot, I want to give you 4 common myths about generosity. 4 myths. Okay, this is what people believe, and there's no basis for it, but this is what they believe, okay? Myth number 1, people believe that generosity is spontaneous. They believe that generosity is spontaneous. Now, this doesn't mean that generous people aren't spontaneous, but generosity is not a spontaneous thing, okay? We've already kind of covered this one. It's giving to a cause that comes up from time to time, or you help a family in need, or we give to those in need after a natural disaster. We call that generous. That's average. Okay, most people do that. We think that's being honest. We think it's being generous. It's honestly just average. And a lot of times we're generous so that we can get something back from it. Okay, I love this. It's an old story. Some of you have heard it, but there's a small pastor is explaining to his congregation that his small church was in need of some extra money. So he asked them to consider just being a little extra generous in the offering plate that day. And he offered that whoever gave the most money would be able to pick out 3 hymns. They get to pick them out. And so after the offering plates were passed at that church, the pastor, kind of a country preacher, he glanced down and he saw a $100 bill in the offering plate. Well, this was a big deal for this little church. And so with great joy, he shared it with the congregation. And he said, I'd like to thank the person who put this $100 bill in the offering plate. And there's a very quiet, kind of saintly, elderly looking lady in the back of the church. And she shyly raises her hand and he says, I want you to come forward. And he kind of makes a big deal over her. And he says, it's so wonderful that you gave so much. And he said, in order to thank you, I want you to pick out 3 hymns. And her eyes kind of brightened. She looked out at the congregation and she finds the 3 most handsome men in the church. She says, I'll take him and him and him. Now, that's not the kind of generosity we're looking for, okay? Generous people are actually less spontaneous in their giving than the average person. Would you believe that? Generous people are actually less emotional in their giving. Generous people are actually more strategic in their giving. It's not hit and miss. It's not so much, oh, I'm touching the heart, here's $20. Now, generous people do that, but it's way more strategic than that. They have a much bigger vision than that. Secondly, generosity is determined by cash flow. That's a myth. Generosity is not determined by cash flow. I can be generous today, but I can't be generous tomorrow. I just got paid, so I'll be generous. We're at the end of the month, I can't be generous. That somehow a person's ability to be generous is determined by cash flow. Generous people are consistently generous. Generous people, their generosity is not determined by cash flow, okay? Here's the third myth. It's the amount that counts. That's not true. This one drives me crazy. Oh, this was such a generous gift. He made such an amazingly generous, she gave such a generous gift. And I'm thinking, no one knows if that's a generous gift except the person that gave it. No one knows that. No one knows that the amount of zeros don't really matter. Adding zeros to the amount doesn't necessarily determine whether or not a gift was generous. It may be a lot of money compared to what I make. It may be a lot of money compared to what you make, but we're fooling ourselves in thinking that we're generous is by looking at the amount of money. Boy, that was a generous donation. Maybe, maybe not. Another myth. This is true. This is true that this is a myth, okay? Rich people are generous. That's a myth. We like to think that way. Like we think if I had more money that I would be really generous. That's not how that works. Here's the truth, okay? You ready for this? It's profound. Rich people are rich, generous people are generous. Okay? It's true. Rich people are rich, generous people are generous. Being rich does not make you generous. The amount of money you have does not determine whether or not you'll be generous. Your income does not determine whether or not you'll be generous. It doesn't. Your income has actually nothing to do with whether or not you're a generous person. There's no natural correlation. I want to talk to those of you that are in the millennial generation right now, in your 20s, maybe early 30s. There's quite a few of you at Compass now, and we love that. And I'm going to tell you this, and this is actually going to make me unpopular with my generation, the Gen Xers and the Bridgers, and those of you that are in the Boomer generation. This is going to make some of you a little upset, but I will tell you this. I think the millennial generation has a chance to be the greatest generation of our time. I really believe that. I really do. I've raised 3 of them. And I've interacted a lot with the 20-somethings and with their friends. And these are amazing kids, and I believe in them. You say, oh, the future of the church is so suspect. No, the future of the world is suspect. The future of the church is going to be just fine. Trust me. God is in control of that. But here's the thing I want to say to all of you who are in your 20s and early 30s. Here's the thing I want you to understand. If you are not generous now, when by American standards you may not be wealthy yet, if you're not generous now, when you get rich, you will just be a rich person who's not generous, okay? If you're not generous now, you probably won't be generous later. My encouragement to you is to be generous right now. You start being generous right now. You learn how to be generous. You listen to what I'm telling you in this series. You learn how to be a generous person now because you think you have this myth, you have this illusion that someday when I make a whole bunch of money, I'm going to be generous. And that, I'll tell you what's going to happen. Someday when you make a whole bunch of money, you're just going to spend it, okay? You're just going to spend it. Chances are you will not be any more generous then than you are now. So you be generous right now. You start today because it is a myth that rich people are generous. So the question is, what does being generous look like? It's really 4 things, okay? And I'm just now to my outline, and it says I have 5 minutes. So here we go, okay? You're gonna be so impressed by this. I'm gonna do this whole outline in like 2 minutes, okay? In fact, if I were to accomplish that, that would be applause worthy, in my opinion. But I'm just saying, like, I just think that probably it would mandate a clap. But you can pray about that, okay? So here's the deal. I'm gonna give you this 4-point outline, and here it is. Being generous is 4 things. Being generous is premeditated. It's premeditated. This means you've gotta have a plan. You need to have a plan. If you're gonna be a generous person, you have to plan it out. I guess they want me to go a little faster, all right. Number 2, I'm gonna get through it because the slide person is gonna make me get through it, right? Being generous is calculated, it's calculated. Generous people already know how much they're gonna give. They've prayed about it. They've already prayed about it, they've thought through it. Number 3, being generous is designated. It's designated. They know where it's gonna go. They've already prayed about this. They've studied, they've researched. They already know where their money's gonna go. And number 4, and this word's a little clunky, but I really like it, okay? Being generous is emancipating, okay? Not to be confused with constipating. Emancipating, okay? Completely opposite of that, right? It's emancipating. It's a freeing feeling when you're generous. Generous people aren't possessed by their possessions. They're willing to let their things go, and those things don't have control over them. So if you want to be generous, you can't allow money to have control over you. That's the simplest way I can say it. And if you want to know what generosity is, here's the definition that we'll stick with the next couple of weeks. Generosity is the premeditated, calculated, designated emancipation of your personal finances. That's what generosity is. Generosity is the premeditated, calculated, designated emancipation of your personal finances. Here's what I hope you hear in this definition. When you free your money, you free yourself from money. You have money, money doesn't have you anymore. And with the time we have left today, I promise you, we're gonna go to a passage of scripture, something that Jesus quoted, okay? And the Apostle Paul quotes Jesus, okay? I'm gonna show it to you in just a minute. And this is a very, very important quote because Paul is saying, this is something that Jesus said. Now, I wanna just say this. If you haven't agreed with anything that I've said today, that's okay. I love you. Hopefully you love me, okay? Maybe you're in the category of you're ready to walk out of here and go, worst sermon ever. He was really off today, okay? That's okay. You don't have to agree with what I have said. That's okay. We learned this last week that we can love people that don't vote like us. Amen, right? Let me say that again. We can love people that don't vote like us, right? Absolutely we can, right? We can love on people that don't think like we do politically or socially or that kind of thing. So you can also love someone that you may not agree with, but here's what I need you to understand. Everything that I've said to this point right now has there's a lot of Drew in there, right? And there was some Paul in 1 Timothy, so that was really important. But these are words straight from the mouth of Jesus. In fact, here's what Paul says. He says, you should remember the words of the Lord Jesus. It's more blessed to give than to receive. Now here's what I want to remind you about. This is coming from the mouth of Jesus. And here's what I'm gonna say about Jesus. Here's what I want you to understand about Jesus is that, here's what I've always said about Jesus. If a guy can predict his death and resurrection and then back it up, I'm with that guy. Anybody else? Right? If a guy can predict his death and resurrection, I am going with whatever he says. I'm gonna do with whatever he says. And here's what he says. It's more blessed to give than to receive. It just is. Jesus is saying, when you live a generous life, you will be blessed, or would you believe in the New Testament, anytime you see the word blessed, you can almost always substitute the word happy. When you live a generous life, you will be happy. Now, always this happens, whenever you teach something like this, you have a few people that say, Drew's gone prosperity gospel on us. No. I'm telling you that Jesus says something happens to a person's heart when they're generous. You could also say it like this: happy is the person whose life is ordered around giving rather than receiving. Happy is the person's life who's ordered around giving rather than to receiving. I've been privy to a few deathbed confessions as a pastor. I don't like that, but I've been to hospitals. I've never heard anybody ever one time say, boy, I wish I would have received more than I gave. I have heard a few people say, I wish I'd have been a little more generous in my life. I've heard a few people say that. When generosity gets a front seat in your life instead of a back seat, when you learn the art of giving away rather than receiving, guess what? Your life will be more joyful. Your life will be more fun. Your life will be more blessed. Happy is the person whose life is ordered around giving rather than receiving. It's been about 2 weeks now that our team went to India, and we had the opportunity one day to hand out clothes at our beloved CICM to village children in the nearby areas. It's pretty spectacular. These kids show up on Thursday afternoon, and they call it the feeding program because we feed them some food and their parents some food. They're encouraged to bring their moms, and so many of the moms are there. They're sitting in an extra area. They sang songs for us, and we worshiped with them, and it was absolutely amazing. It's just life-changing when you get to be a part of that. But there was a moment where we were asked, we provide for these feeding days. Compass gives a lot of money to Central India Christian Mission to provide for these kids. They're village kids, and they live out in the outskirts of town. And so many of them, the way you see them dressed, you're like, well, they're really well dressed. They're well dressed because they go there every Thursday, and they get pretty much just about every Thursday they get something new to wear, and it's just such a huge moment for them. But a part that I loved most about that particular moment was when we were given 15-pound bags of rice. And I had the privilege of giving it to the 2- and 3-year-old girls. And this is me, yeah, what do you do, right? And so I'm passing these 15-pound bags of rice. Glad for me, you did that. I mean, your resources did that, and so we're passing these rice out to these children. And I will just tell you, as we were going back to our place where we stayed, I looked at Shannon, I looked at Rob, and I looked at Michelle, and I just said, I can't remember. I'm sure I have had. I don't remember having more fun than what we just had. I don't remember a moment in my life where I had more joy than that moment. I don't remember it. If I do, I just couldn't remember it. Because joyful and happy is the person whose life is ordered around giving rather than receiving. Paul said this to Timothy, command those who are rich in this present world. I would submit to you that it's most of our listening audience. There's exceptions, I know that. But most of our listening audience is falls in this category. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. And then he says this, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous, and to be willing to share. And then look at verse 19, this is new. In this way, they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of life that is truly life. In the next few weeks, that is my prayer for you. I hope that through this study, that God wakes me up to the reality of the difference between being generous and being a giver. And I hope God wakes you up to that reality too. And promise me just one thing. Don't feel guilty because of this series. Just feel grateful. Don't feel guilty. Guilt never does anything for anybody. Don't feel guilty, just feel grateful, okay? Congratulations. You've been given special honor. You are rich in this present world, almost all of you. The question is, will you be any good at it? Will you be any good at being rich? And if you want to be a different kind of crazy, come back next week and find out how you can be the kind of crazy that Jesus calls us to be crazy, generous. I'm gonna pray over you right now. God, in the next few weeks, simply put, teach us just how to be generous. Amen. Love you guys.